The presentation I'll give this morning is a quick overview of the Education Outcomes Fund for Africa and the Middle East. I will start off giving an overview of sort of what it is and where it came from. There's a few links to the GSG. I'll talk a bit about our project pipeline. So we've got two projects launching in Ghana and Sierra Leone, as well as the implications of COVID-19 and how that's affecting the work we do, which I'm sure is relevant to a few people. And then it would be good to finish the discussion just with how we're looking to expand, the partners we're looking to bring onto the journey, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. Francesca sent out a pre-read. Hopefully people have had a chance to look at it. If not, I'll just give a very quick overview of the model as well. And I'll assume some basic knowledge of impact bonds in terms of what they are and how they work. Hopefully that's a reasonable assumption for this group. But if anyone has never heard of an impact bond, then just shout and I can give a very quick overview of that as well. So in terms of where EOF or the Education Outcomes Fund came from, back in 2017, I was working with UK NAB, and we put out a report called The Rise of Impact: 5 Steps Towards a Complete and Sustainable Economy. And one of the recommendations was about strengthening the UK's role in international development, and the fact that the UK had one of the more advanced and mature impact investing ecosystems domestically, and then separately they were also a big player in international development, but there was very little connection between the two. And I think this is a common story. So DFID, the UK aid agency, has a 14 billion pound aid budget, which is pretty significant. But there was no connection between the work of DFID and the domestic impact investing ecosystem, and specifically impact bonds and outcomes funds have been regularly used in the UK, but this hadn't been translated to the UK's international work. At the same time, Gordon Brown, who after he was UK Prime Minister went on to become the UN Special Envoy for Global Education. And he led something called the Education Commission, where he brought together a whole series of world leaders and Nobel Prize winners to put a spotlight on the global learning crisis. So, some pretty scary headlines like the fact that we're going to have half of the world's 1.6 billion young people either out of school or failing to learn by 2030, by the time we're meant to be achieving the SDGs. And actually, we're going backwards on this problem. In large part because of sub-Saharan Africa, where there's this combination of very high population growth rates and then quite weak education systems that are struggling to keep up. And so, although the world's come a long way with getting more children back into school with access, actually there's a huge portion of children who are in school but failing to learn the basics. So the Commission made a whole series of recommendations about the need for both more funding, but also more effective funding for global education to help address the learning crisis. At the same time, Ronnie, who obviously you all know as chair of the GSG and one of the longtime champions of impact bonds, had been thinking about how to scale up the instrument. And so there was a natural partnership. These two have a sort of long history together. So they came together about 2 years ago to set up EOF, with the ambition to raise and deploy $1 billion of results-based financing to help address the learning crisis. And so, just a few links to the GSG there in terms of both, obviously, Ronnie's role, but then also, very much supporting one of these recommendations that came out of the work of the UK NAB as well. So this core idea of using existing resources more effectively is really central to what we do. So I just want to quickly touch on how we're using resources today. This chart shows the foreign aid for education. So from developed to developing countries, there's around $3.3 billion US per year just for education in the Middle East and Africa in foreign aid. The chart's called a Marimekko chart, and the way it works is that the width of the columns is proportionate to how much funding comes from each of those. and then the height of each segment shows where that funding is going to. So you can see that the UK gave a total of 475 million, of which the bulk went to Ethiopia, Tanzania, and so on. And to me, this is it's a fascinating picture because you can see a whole lot of history and politics, steeped in terms of where this money comes from and where it's going. But actually, the main point is that we are already spending significant resources to help try and address the learning crisis. But the way that we're spending this money often undermines the impacts we're trying to have, and especially in education. What often goes wrong today, there's sort of a laundry list of problems, but one of the key ones is that because all these aid organizations need accountability to their taxpayers and so on in terms of how the funding is being used, they create accountability around activities. So they say, you have to do a very precisely prescribed set of activities, and then we'll hold you to account to make sure that you've done those activities. And frankly, what this means is that we're aligning incentives to the wrong thing. We're aligning incentives to the activity as opposed to the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And there's countless examples of how this goes wrong. To give one quick anecdote, one of the major aid agencies went into an African country and had a $70 million program to deliver textbooks to every single school in the country. And in terms of how the program was designed, it was a success in terms of what it set out to do. So, tick, they spent the money, and tick, they delivered the activity that they set out to do, which was deliver textbooks. The problem is, if you go to these schools, what you'll now find is storage cupboards with unopened boxes full of textbooks. And there's a whole series of reasons why they weren't used, and there was problems with the curriculum and so on. But basically, the impact on learning was very low. And unfortunately, this type of story is far too common. And so the idea with the Education Outcomes Fund is that we shift that basis of accountability. So rather than holding, spending this, these aid budgets and philanthropic money in a way where we hold account to the activity, we say, let's pay for the end outcome of what we care about, which in the case of the learning crisis is, at its core, it's about improving literacy and numeracy rates for children and young people who today are failing to learn the basics. And when we pay for outcomes, a few really significant things happen. One is that it forces people, the implementing partners, to think much more holistically about the problem, because if they're now being held accountable for getting kids to learn, then obviously it's not just about textbooks. You have to think about it more holistically in terms of the needs of the students, the teachers, the broader community, if there's missing infrastructure, and so on. And you have to work in a way that's very context specific, because the needs of one country to the next will certainly be very different, and even from one school to the next. So if we're not working in a context specific way to address the sort of very local needs, then we're not going to be solving this problem. Secondly, it really incentivizes using data in a much more real-time way. So constantly having sort of data feedback loops to the front line and to the work that we're doing to see, is this working, and if not, how do we course correct? And finally, it incentivizes collaboration in a different way, because often the NGOs that we fund to do this work might just bring one piece of the puzzle, in that they will, for instance, improve teacher motivation, or they will engage the community on certain issues, or they'll supply textbooks, et cetera, et cetera. But if you recognize that we have to address these problems holistically if we're going to really solve the problem, then it becomes a forcing function for better collaboration. And so in this way, we think that we can, by paying for outcomes as opposed to inputs or activities, that we can really scale the impact we're trying to have, not just an intervention. So the EOF model we've set up starts with the beneficiary. So we partner with governments, and together with governments, we identify a target population that we're trying to improve the outcomes for. And we then set what we call a rate card, which basically identifies what outcomes we're trying to achieve. So it might be improved literacy and numeracy, and roughly what price we want to pay for those outcomes, how they'll be measured, and so on. We then have a competitive procurement process to work, to select the implementing partners. Government will still set the regulatory framework in terms of the work they can do, and then government, together with donors, will repay the NGOs for the outcomes that can be achieved. Now, if you're an implementing partner, and I should say it doesn't have to just be non-profits; it can also be for-profit implementing partners. So it's not just NGOs. If you're an implementer on the receiving end of this type of funding, you now have two new problems that you probably didn't have in the past. One, you still need the working capital up front to do the work, and secondly, you now have this financial risk that you might do an intervention, with a set of schools, but you don't achieve the outcomes you expect, and therefore you don't get paid. And so, recognizing that most NGOs aren't well placed to bear that risk, that's why we use the impact bond structure, where we bring in social investors who essentially solve both of those problems for the NGO. So they provide the working capital up front, and they take the risk that if the initiative doesn't work and you don't achieve the outcome, then they're the ones who don't get paid. So this is the sort of general model. The way we tell the story, I think, has had a few iterations as well. So we started off explaining this in a very mechanism-led way, where we would talk about the structure of the flow of funds, and often people in the development community would react quite badly to that, because they would sort of see it as a sort of fancy widget. One person described it as sort of excessive financial engineering for financial engineering's sake, and of course we don't believe that's what it is. But the way you tell the story does make a big difference. And so telling the story in this way, where we're making it very clear that actually it's all about starting with the needs of the beneficiary, and then all these different partners in the model working towards this common aim to support the needs of the beneficiary, and then also government having a really clear role. There's a few ways this is different to some of the existing SIB and DIB efforts. One is that we're just trying to do it at a much larger scale. So some of you might be familiar, for instance, with the Educate Go's Development Impact Bond, which I think cost something like $1 million to set up, and then $1 million on the evaluation, and then there was only about 400,000 in actually paying for outcomes. And so obviously at that scale, it's sort of interesting R&D around the instrument, if you will, just to test the concept, but you would never want to continue to do it at that scale in the long term, I think. So we're looking to set up programs that are more in the range of $30 to $50 million in outcomes funding. And our first program in Ghana is exactly that. It's a $30 million program to improve literacy and numeracy rates. When you scale the program in that way, obviously the fixed transaction costs around setting these things up become much smaller as a portion of the total funding. Secondly, we want to build institutional capacity to do these faster and better. So most efforts have been quite fragmented, where it's lots of different people sort of trying to figure out how to do these instruments and structure them sort of for the first time. And there's been a lot of reinventing the wheel, and a lot of inefficiencies in that process, we think. It is quite a complex instrument, and we think there's a huge learning curve associated with it, where if you essentially do the same type of transaction for a second time, and then a third time, and then a fourth time, each time there's so much to draw on in terms of what you've already done to essentially learn from previous mistakes, build on those assets of previous structurings, and essentially significantly lower transaction costs, which is point number 3. And then another important difference is that because we start with a partnership with government to set the outcomes framework, we don't necessarily start with a sort of prescribed view of who the investors or who the implementers will be. So we essentially run a procurement process once we've designed the whole funding framework, to competitively select implementers and investors. Many development impact bonds to date have come together more organically in terms of the different partners being pre-selected and then structuring the transaction together with them. And with this model, the ambition is to try and reach 10 million children and youth across these three areas. So early childhood education, quality and basic education, and then skills for employment. And you can see some of the example payment metrics there. So, for early childhood education, we want to pay for a young child who is now ready for school. In basic education, we want to pay for a child who can read and write or transitions to secondary school, for instance. And then in TVET, rather than paying for the training program, we want to pay for the young person who gets a job and keeps that job. This is some of our sponsors and supporters so far. So on the left-hand side, you can see the foundations that have been supporting this effort. DFID has definitely been one of the main advocates, and as I already mentioned, the team within DFID actually were the same team that set up and structured a lot of the UK domestic outcomes funds. So they then had all that experience from the UK. So then when they went into DFID, they were really well placed to understand the rationale for the whole thing and really internally push the case for this. And so of the aid agencies, they're definitely the ones that are sort of furthest ahead, and they're the main funder active of our first two programs. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the institutional partners. So we're working closely with both governments in Sierra Leone and in Ghana. And one of the big challenges over the last sort of 6 to 12 months has been resolving our institutional hosting. Because if you want to receive significant funding from aid agencies such as DFID, you need to have a sort of trusted fiduciary establishment to manage those funds. So for Ghana, we're partnering with the World Bank, and then in Sierra Leone and beyond, we're being hosted at UNICEF as an independent trust fund, who will be the custodian of the funds. And then we've had some fantastic pro bono legal support from Reed Smith and Freshfields in helping structure all this. So that's the sort of overall story of EOF in a nutshell. Just checking how I'm going with the time. Okay, so I'll very quickly speak to some of the first programs. So as mentioned, the two we're looking to launch this year are the two you can see on the left-hand side. So Ghana and Sierra Leone, that'll be $20 and $30 million programs respectively. And then we've been discussing, with a whole range by the government and have various scoping studies underway, looking at a skills program in Egypt and Jordan, and an early childhood program in Ethiopia as well. The Ghana program has two main objectives in terms of the outcomes, which you can see on the left-hand side. So we're looking to reintegrate out-of-school children back into formal education. And then in those schools, we're looking to improve the learning outcomes, i.e. literacy and numeracy rates for all children in those schools. And the map you can see shows the districts that we were working in. We're looking at targeting 700 schools and reaching about 300,000 children. The Sierra Leone program is going to be quite similar in terms of the objectives. So it's also focusing on improving literacy and numeracy. In Sierra Leone, we're building on an existing program that the government has there called the Education Innovation Challenge. And that's the sort of pilots you can see on the left-hand side here, where they already have this program in 170 schools where they have NGOs working to support the school to help improve learning, and they have an RCT evaluation around that. And so we're using the EOF model to significantly scale that program up, but on an outcomes basis. So expanding from 170 to 800 schools with a 3-year implementation contract where the first year will be funded actually on an input basis, and then we'll transition to outcomes funding for years 2 and 3. and the government has an explicit objective to use this to help inform what's working best in order to then take the best interventions to national scale. COVID-19 obviously has changed the world in which we all live. In the context of our programs, when the pandemic was sort of starting to accelerate, we had a moment of worrying what all this was going to mean for us. Would governments be too distracted to go ahead? Actually, from all the governments we're talking to, they're very keen for us to go ahead, this year as planned, despite the fact that there are school closures. But obviously, we have to adapt the design to respond to that. And one of the most important ways that we're adapting the design is putting a sort of greater focus on distance learning interventions. So, obviously none of us know exactly how this is going to play out, but if there is definitely a sort of plausible or maybe even likely scenario in which, school closures continue to happen intermittently over the next year at least, or maybe even more, then we need to make sure that children, continue to learn even when schools are closed. And in the context of rural Ghana or rural Sierra Leone, this isn't like the developed world where everyone can just sort of go home and get on their computer with their high-speed broadband internet access. There's a real question about the availability of infrastructure. And so what this page shows is how we're starting to think about, depending on the level of infrastructure availability in the places we're working, what types of interventions can be incorporated into these programs to help ensure that children continue to learn. So there's some promising programs around radio broadcasting, for instance, which all households need is electricity, and then for those that have some degree of mobile access, then there's a whole series of interventions there as well. Just to quickly summarize the two programs that I spoke to, so this is a comparison of the main terms. You can see across, so for Ghana and Sierra Leone, you can see the targeted impact, so 700 and 800 schools respectively. The level of outcomes funding is slightly less than the total program size, because we need funding for the evaluation primarily, and other things. The target return for investors is an interesting discussion. So where we're looking at targeting around 8% base case returns for Ghana and 10% in Sierra Leone. This is roughly in line, we think, with the precedent set from other DIBs around the world. It's probably still below sort of commercial risk-adjusted returns, given the level of risk involved in these programs. But we think, given we're sort of really at an inflection point with impact investing, and a lot of the bigger institutional investors are now having a lot of pressure to enter this space, we're seeing no shortage of demand from investors. And yeah, we can share this presentation afterwards, so you can have a look at this in more detail if it's interesting. So in terms of the partnership opportunities and how we're looking to bring others into this, I guess there's probably three main ways. I imagine most relevant for the GSG network is investors. So as we continue to roll these programs out, we're looking to develop a network of investors who sort of we know, who know us and understand the model, and we'll be sort of marketing the programs to with the hope that they can participate on the investor side. The biggest constraint for the whole ecosystem is definitely the outcomes funding, and DFID has really been leading the charge with putting significant funding into this initiative and generally trying to scale up the ecosystem. But we're definitely sort of looking for other foundations or CSR donors, others who could be interested in this approach and paying for outcomes. And lastly, to the extent that implementers, if you or organizations in your network have, for instance, sort of promising ed tech interventions that you think could really be successes in this program in terms of achieving the outcomes, then we definitely want to make sure that they're aware of the pipeline projects as well.